talk about how I see potential futures and put the accent here on the plural. I'm going to share my screen here and bring up. So I've been thinking about, what's next, and obviously there's so many uncertainties that you can't actually forecast what would be next. Is I think a point that everybody has made. But I've been outlining for policymaker audience here in Washington what could be on the horizon, hoping that they choose number 3. So we're going to look at what I consider 2 bad scenarios before we get to the third. But first one is the great accelerator downward. And this is basically a lot of the trends that we saw before the crisis are aggravated. And the big trend here was, a lot of state-on-state competition leading to conflict, more protectionism, so potential for globalization, and that was happening before the crisis hit. And the crisis, because it first in this scenario lingers. We don't get a vaccine very early, so you always have those fears, and you have potentially more waves of the pandemic. And you also have a very difficult recovery. So everybody is hoping, obviously, for the V-shaped recovery, and it takes much longer. And this is a bad recovery for all the major economic drivers in the world: US, Europe, and China. So everybody, in a sense, is suffering on the economic side as well as with the health crisis. And there is some minimal cooperation at the beginning, but then basically everybody of the 3 part waves. And in this particularly, and you're already beginning to see this in Washington, US, we have in this scenario, there's a bigger write-up of all these scenarios. We have a Trump administration that gets reelected and basically remains wedded to the tariffs against China, bringing back as much manufacturing back to the US, very protectionist regime, and erecting, in the sense too, against disinformation, erecting a firewall against Chinese and Russian communications. So you see here really almost a reenactment of the 1920s and 1930s. And it's only a matter of time before you actually get to a hot war. So in the second one, and China does come out first. This is obviously the big fear at the moment in Washington. And it is not just because they seem to be the first on the recovery, but also is that they spot an opportunity. The US and Europe are so self-absorbed that they're not paying attention as to what is happening in the developing world. China obviously has a vested interest in terms of its Belt and Road policy, so they go and start investing more. It's also a way for them to begin to create an external market, so long as US and Europe, as I said, are very still trying to dig themselves out of the crisis. Obviously, and we've seen this, the Chinese Communist Party has taken a huge hit with the pandemic, but they can deflect some of that criticism at home by pointing out just how badly the democratic world has dealt with this, and where that doesn't work, obviously they use suppression. In the US, you have and Europe, because you have a very slow recovery, again, you have these protectionist urges. You have racism in the US really come, Asian Americans are attacked, which has already happened. And you see really populism beginning to flourish just as the way it did after 2008. But in this scenario, it's they adopt Bernie Sanders' ideas, and you really have a movement. First, you have huge debt. So how do you bring that down? Is you need to really tax, and there's a real, with populism, it's much more leftward leaning. They want to have a wealth tax. They want to have go after the wealthy in this, and because China seems to be heading out there first and really taking advantage almost of the situation, you actually have the US and Europe coming together in NATO, and NATO begins to look at China as the new enemy. In the third scenario, you have the same thing happening in the sense that you have a still lingering economic recovery. And you also have a long period in which you still have the threat of the virus, even though it's been more controlled. But in this one, you have really the revival of what we saw after 2008 of G7, G20 cooperation. Now, I think, realistically, that this is only going to happen if you have a change of administration in Washington. Even though at the moment, Biden, who looks to be the Democratic challenger, is talking internationally, but he's also very talking very nationalistic about China. But in any event, in this scenario, we have basically G20 coming back into taking the position it did after 2008 and really coordinating a recovery. And in this sense, also working on the coordinated lifting of border closures. And I think we haven't talked as much about that, but I think the fact now we all have these strong borders in place are going to be a problem if we're going to get back towards open societies and that even in Europe, a single market. You have a real emphasis on really conquering disease in this scenario, and that's where you have the idea of setting up an agency which will make sure that this will never, such a crisis and tragedy will not be happen ever again. And this warning agency actually has some teeth. They can sanction countries who don't take action on these big global challenges, and that includes over time climate change. Now there's obviously a huge debate. EU is in favor because it looks like another step on the road to a more multilateralist world. China and US are really the holdouts, but China wants an open economy, and the price to be paid for the US and EU dropping the protectionist threat is basically to join this agency and to clean up their, as I call it, the disease cesspools. We've known about these for some time. I was the author of actually the 2008 global trends. We had that scenario. The health community in the US knew that was a huge threat. So this is really forcing China in return for which they can have the open economy. And in the US, you have that same old debate about, giving up sovereignty. But in the end, you have a majority because of just how serious a crisis this has turned into, that they go along with actually multilateralists and going back more to a multilateralist path. reception, we unveiled these about 2 to 3 weeks ago. The reception has been pretty good, except for the fact that there are a lot of people in Washington who do not like scenario 2. So I'll leave it there.